Excellency, distinguished delegates, esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen and students, it is an honor to address this gathering for the 28th time, and in the name of World Information Transfer, I would once again like to give our sincere appreciation to the government of Ukraine and His Excellency Volodymyr Yelchenko, permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations for co-sponsoring this conference since 1992. I would also like to thank the International Council of Women, NGO Committee on Sustainable Development, New York, and the World Association of NGOs for supporting our conference, and to the professors and teachers who brought students to participate in this conference. Exactly 33 years ago, on April 26th, in the area of Chornobyl, Ukraine, one of the world's worst man-made disasters happened. The core in one of the 4 nuclear reactors melted down, the radioactive containment exploded, and the radioactive cloud of dust spread throughout Europe and as far as California. The causes were the inadequate response of the operators at the Chernobyl plant, together with the inadequate safety factors of the design, which led to the catastrophe. However, the greatest tragedy was a decision of the Soviet Union, and not only not to inform the population about the tragedy until 10 days later, but to send young children to celebrate the Communist Parade on May 1st, when the air was still contaminated with nuclear dust. The lack of concern for the health and welfare of the population resulted in a displacement of thousands of citizens and severe physical and mental disorders. Chernobyl was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, but post-traumatic stress disorder, a consequence that we see in our soldiers returning from engagement in wars, affected almost everyone in Ukraine and Belarus. To this day, some people remain traumatized, and the ramifications of Chernobyl will continue to affect future generations. It is important to note that the nuclear power plant design of Chernobyl is still being used not only in Ukraine, but in the surrounding countries in Eastern Europe. When national and international policies are grounded in a perspective of fear and secrecy, then real danger goes unnoticed or is kept secret for fear of the consequences once the danger is exposed. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster and its ongoing effects to human health and the environment exemplifies the long-lasting consequences of fear-based decisions. A quote from Isaac Newton, a physicist and philosopher from the 17th century, emphasizes the effect of fear of change. He writes, "Men build too many walls and not enough bridges. Weak men lay an exaggerated stress on not changing one's mind or behavior." Weak people generally are afraid of change, and that fear prevents both change or modification of behavior, even though it may cause unquestionable harm to the world and its population. Further ramifications of fear can be seen when institutions and governments use their power and influence to the detriment of people and the environment in which they live. Consider the effect of fear on billions of people in our world. In 1969, the world population was 2 billion. Currently, there are over 7 billion inhabitants, and in 2055, the UN is projecting over 10 billion. In 50 years, we have added 5.5 billion people, most of them unaware of the effect they are having on the world's environment, since neither governments nor institutions give them the opportunity to learn the consequences of their behavior or practices. Possible good news is that the current generation does have the ability to change patterns and behaviors through their ability to communicate and modify what is necessary to safeguard the world in which they live. We constantly witness the ongoing changes that are taking place in different parts of the world. What is important is for us to continue to encourage positive change and participation in those practices that enable it. History can teach us what is important so that we do not repeat the same mistakes in the future. The focus of this conference is how to achieve some of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations governments prepared in order to guide the future generations, which include many of you. Today, we will hear our panel present their evaluations of what is needed and what has been achieved. An unexpected finding is that the current situation in Chernobyl, with the absence of people, have created an area where both fauna and flora is thriving. Return of the paradise lost. This certainly is food for thought for those that are concerned with the ongoing destruction of our beautiful planet. In conclusion, I hope that you'll be able to take away from this conference a drive to succeed in making the changes that are necessary for your future and that of your children. Thank you for your attention. It is now my honor and privilege to present His Excellency Volodymyr Yelchenko, who was educated in the Kyiv State University and has experience from 1981 to various countries throughout Europe. Since December 2015, the permanent representative of Ukraine to the United Nations and the representative of Ukraine to the UN Security Council from 2016 to 2017, and diplomatic rank Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary. His Excellency also received the State Awards Order of Merit 3 and 2, and Krzyżewsko do so in Brazil. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Christina. Dear colleagues, distinguished guests, we're very pleased once again to join this essential open dialogue on different aspects of Chernobyl legacy, which has already become a long-lasting tradition for the UN headquarters. First of all, let me thank Dr. Kristina Durbok of the World International Transfer, the conference chair and founder, for being our supporter and partner for so many fruitful years. And I would also like to welcome our distinguished speakers of today's conference. As Dr. Durbok has already mentioned, the primary focus of the attention of the UN member states is the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. In line with this, Ukraine is deeply committed to full and comprehensive implementation of 17 goals and 169 targets adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in September 2015. It should be especially noted that Ukraine is one of the leaders in the region in terms of adaptation and incorporation of the SDGs into national legislation. We keep on working to fulfill our commitments on SDGs related to improving the quality of education, promoting gender equality, and ensuring environmental sustainability. I would like to point out that the approach of the new United Nations system must ensure comprehensive consideration of security, social and environmental aspects, particularly in priority areas such as ecological safety, comprehensive environmental conservation, and risk reduction management. Only such approach will facilitate sustainability and efficiency of the developing world. Today, Ukraine marks 33 years since the Chernobyl disaster, which was the world's worst nuclear accident. In 1986, one of the major humanitarian challenges has stricken Ukraine, its neighboring and other European countries, exposing the unidentified problem of thousands of internally displaced people. This disaster changed the history of the mankind and is recorded in its fabrics as sad and tragic page. The humanity did not know such technological catastrophe before in terms of its scope and complexity of long-standing humanitarian, environmental, health, social, and economic consequences. This catastrophe disrupted the livelihoods of almost 2 million people in more than 2,000 affected locations. Ukraine has made every effort to improve the well-being of affected communities and revive the afflicted districts' economic potential. Strengthening the resilience of affected communities and restoration of their self-reliance is the foundation for their sustainable development and our utmost priority. Unfortunately, after more than 3 decades, the affected areas are still suffering from the impact of the accident. Supported by UN agencies, as well as our American, Canadian, and European partners, and Japan, Ukraine has successfully implemented international projects aimed at sustained recovery and development of affected areas. I would like to emphasize that the shift from restoration of the area to its sustainable socio-economic development can only take place if radiation safety requirements are fully met. Therefore, Ukraine, together with our partners, is focusing on transforming the shelter into an environmentally safe system and completing the construction of the new safe confinement. In November 2016, the new safe confinement was erected. This construction project is unprecedented in the history of engineering. It is the largest movable land-based structure ever built. Never before has such a huge structure been constructed at a heavily contaminated site. The final step is the completion of the construction and commissioning of the facility. Having completed the work on the construction of the new safe confinement, we will create all conditions for the implementation of another ambitious project, the installation of land-based solar panels in the Chornobyl exclusion zone. Understanding the long-term nature of the implications of the Chernobyl accident, we find it essential to continue collaboration with the UN and other international organizations regarding the study and minimization of health, environmental, and socio-economic consequences of the disaster. Also, within the implementation of Ukraine's commitment under the Kyoto Protocol and the energy strategy of Ukraine till 2030, a photovoltaic power station will be constructed in Chernobyl. For this purpose, the territory of the former sports stadium will be cleaned and reconstructed. It will become another step for the alternative energy development in the exclusion zone. One of the primary lessons of Chernobyl was that the world should stay vigilant and united facing such disasters. Despite the considerable progress in rehabilitation of the affected areas, much remains to be done. The Chernobyl legacy will linger for a long while. We should never forget about this. I'm convinced that there is a clear need for a continuous effort to keep the issue of post-Chernobyl recovery high on the interagency and international agendas. We must also continue to carry out various events within the UN and other international organizations, just like the one we have right now, dedicated to the consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. I thank you for your attention and invite you for a friendly and professional discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Our next presenter, and please forgive me, I am moving fast because I would like to get everybody to have their time. Our next presenter is Dr. Scott Radson. Dr. Radson, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, and let me first say to Dr. Durbach, congratulations. I've been a number of years joining this meeting, and it was the first decade, so 20 years ago after speaking here, actually then being invited to participate in UN activities on health and risk communication, and have advanced a career where I'm now currently at Harvard as a senior fellow in the Kennedy School of Government's Business and Government Center, in where we're looking at multi-sectoral approaches and multidisciplinary approaches of bringing all groups together to solve the problems of our time. So very quickly, I had been engaged in the old ECOSOC chamber with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on women and children's health, and that's the picture that's in the left, but not to belabor the opportunities that we worked on, Every Woman, Every Child, and women and children's health. We moved forward on innovation into other areas. And today what I wanted to speak about was something that I think is one of the biggest challenges of our time in the public health world, which is something that should be very simply dealt with, but is a big challenge with the world of communication that we have. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is what I'd like to talk about, the uncertainty of our fields, not only dealing with both the culture of safety that we'll hear about, and as His Excellency Yelchenko has said, the challenges that we will not forget and we will continue to improve so well upon science and policy making. And that's what I wanted to talk about today with vaccination and then multi-sectoral engagement. To move to the next slide, I would also say that what I'm engaged in is not only on the global area, but historical area of how we have to continue to try to push the rock over the hill on these kind of challenges. And these challenges date back to, Sisyphus in Homer's writings, that was condemned to immortality by always pushing the rock over the hill and never getting it over the hill. I know we have the Honorable Carolyn Comita later talking about the challenges in the U.S. and also the state level, but this is something that we face every day. So as we move forward, the next slide, please. I also dig back to the 1948 World Health Organization preamble, and the preamble does speak in a way that we all need to be involved for better outcomes. So informed opinion, active cooperation on the part of the public are the utmost importance in the improvement of health of the people. You can certainly take that in the environmental world, the world we're in today, of how we get everybody's engagement. And let me again thank WIT, the board, and others who have continued to foster this dialogue, as well as the fine internship program that Carolyn and others continue to engage all of us on these kind of challenges. So the next slide, please, reminds us that we can't do this the old-fashioned way. And it's not just the old-fashioned way of policymaking in big buildings and the billions on the planet. We need new approaches in the field that I'm in public health. I'm a public health physician. We need new ways of looking at non-communicable diseases, which are another big part of the challenge of how people lead healthier lives. So the next slide, please. I've been fortunate to try to put this in the literature, which is a journal of health communication, a peer-reviewed journal that I've been editing now for 24 years. And in here, we tried to say thousands of pages, but hundreds of professors have been fortunate to put their ideas forward in what we call this peer-reviewed literature that is the way that we help make decisions in science. So the next slide, please. Just quickly, I'll skip over this other than saying that Sisyphus and the future of health communication, we try with many different partnerships. We have bilateral agencies. The United States Agency for International Development is one. And then we have other ways of working on coalitions and ways of trying to address public health challenges with all sorts of activities, some of which are put here that have been done with mobile health, where we used to say, or we still try to say, right, the phone is almost, I know certainly the young people coming in, this is more important to you than a wristwatch. This is more important to you, at least I have two sons, that this is the biggest connectivity. If you don't have your phone with you, how can we get health in the hands of people? And some of the challenges here with both the White House, the U.S. State Department, and globally, we've tried to put health messages for women during pregnancy and for mothers making decisions about their kids' vaccination. So this is a future opportunity. If we go to the next slide, please. So where does that leave us today? And let me say, if I can welcome on behalf of WIT the many, many students. I know it was difficult to get in here today. I'm speaking about the challenges that we face for health communication, how we communicate difficult messages, mostly related to health issues with vaccination at this point. So the next slide, please. The global response to these Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see all around this building, 17 goals, 169 targets. And if we go to the next slide, please, these are the goals. I don't know if you're taking this in your classes. There are classes around the United States and world now that are training or suggesting to remind people of poverty, health and well-being, gender equity, and all the important pieces that the world leaders have agreed upon to address by 2030. The next slide, please. So this is what I think is one of the biggest issues we face today. Both the the Director General of UNICEF as well as World Health Organization just wrote on this big challenge together a 300% increase that we have this year on measles globally, and still thousands of children unfortunately die from this around the world. So the next slide, please. These are just some of the numbers that are there, that we know that vaccination, while you might think this is new, this is an 18th century technology. When we first eradicated smallpox, or began to eradicate smallpox with the discovery by Edward Jenner of the smallpox vaccination, we've had a whole number of different vaccinations that have been successful. And as you can see, while those may have had success for 2 to 3 million deaths that have been averted, we nonetheless have a new hesitancy that's come into place. And if you're interested, there's a whole literature, for better or worse, that has been developing, because this is not just happening miles from here in Brooklyn or in other places around the world. This is happening in, unfortunately, hearts and minds of parents that are not necessarily bad or wrong. They just might not have the necessary information to help make that informed decision that we all think would be best for society and our communities. So the next slide, please. The other piece is what happens here in New York could be in the world in no time, notwithstanding the phones. Unfortunately, this was the traveling by the Vaccine Confidence Project out of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that Heidi Larson presented, that when some physician in Colombia said we shouldn't have a cervical cancer vaccine, HPV vaccine for girls in Colombia, before you knew it was in Denmark and in Japan, and before you knew it, 3 countries don't offer this vaccine in the way that could prevent thousands of deaths in the future. So this is very connected. The next slide, please, actually calls them anti-vaxxers. And as we keep moving, that's why we can move to the next slide in the interest of the necessary call to action that I'd like to mention today. So in the last number of weeks, I've been fortunate not only at Harvard, at the Kennedy School, but linking with others at UCLA School of Public Health, Jonathan Fielding, in Georgetown and others, to look at how we address this in a way that will make a huge difference in the United States. And now we're actually calling for what we need to do about this globally, and the term is vaccine literacy. How do we get policymakers, ambassadors, physicians, parents to work together on the solid idea that this is how we protect the future of our children, and frankly, if we can use the term, a beachhead for society in terms of the values that we need for public health. So the next couple of slides, I'll go through these. These are just some articles. I began doing this in 2003. We called it Misled and Confused. But as we go to the next one, this is the last few weeks that we've been talking about what we need to do. 1, an investment, multi-sector approach. 2, communicate clearly, and there's a lot of experts here in communicating. 3, advanced social media principles. Why should we even foster some of these, not only falsehoods, mistruths, but whatever we might call them? Thank you. And then finally, can we come up with a campaign? And those of you who've lived in the United States, you know who that person or that icon is in the bottom right corner. That's a 75-year-old icon, Smokey the Bear, who reminds us only you can prevent forest fires. Forest fires affect everyone, but it's an individual action. We think we can do that, and this week's Journal of the American Medical Association, we've called for that, and the Washington Post and others. So today I just want to try to wrap up in the next few minutes that I have to go to the next couple of slides. What does this mean for all of us? I believe it means here at the United Nations, whether you're studying, whether you want to enter the field of health communication, international relations, all of us have one common currency, and that's health. It's the one common currency where we know that we have science that is addressed to a place with simple vaccinations as preventing disease, but we're losing that to some of the challenges that we face and the mistrust in government, the mistrust in areas, and we need to rebuild all of that together. So I think we can do that through these kind of partnerships, through these kind of discussions and dialogues, and the power that we have with modern media. So finally, we go to the next slide. We have these two Sustainable Development Goals, number 3 and number 17. Those we need to figure out partnerships to address health and well-being. And the next slide, please. We've come up with some guiding principles at Harvard that we've published. You can do a search for my name, or you can see them at the bottom. We think these are very simple, that could be scaled by companies, by governments, by local endeavors. If you follow these principles and you approach them in a way, just as the UN was so successful with the human rights principles, the guiding principles that John Ruggie did, and that took over 6 years, and then the children and human rights principles later by UNICEF and so forth, we have made a huge difference in the space. Can we do the same with addressing health issues and take this to the level with vaccination? So in the final slides, we think that we can do this with this multi-sectoral engagement. We've had the World Health Organization say that these principles are helpful. Next one, please. And we need to do this, however, and realize we need to do this with a small budget or no budget. So that's the Sisyphean challenge. How can we continue to make the sum bigger than the individual parts? And next slide, please. We could do this with strategic diplomacy. We have world information transfer as that's the logo in the bottom left. We've been doing it through planting great seeds and great ideas over all these years with ethical, sound communication. And I think there's nothing better than many of you who want to enter a career or coming here to the UN to hear today. And Klaus Schwab said this to leaders at the World Economic Forum, which is the quote of the leaders of the global environment in terms of business. But all of you are the future leaders here as well today. And strategic diplomacy is something we're all doing together. And the next slide, please. This is not just a pie-in-the-sky idea. We need to try this. We could go through a whole big evidence base, and we're going to hear that today, of what we've learned from Chernobyl, what we're able to do in terms of the future with cleaner energy, safer environments, and experiences and opportunities. And I'm hopeful that we can do that with great impact. As I started saying, I'm a public health physician, so I'm a believer that we need to do this with health, and environment, and all these are so well intertwined. And hopefully today we'll have that opportunity to talk more and hear about the good ideas. And many of you can dedicate your lives and your research and your activities in such a place. So I think that's it. Is there one last piece beyond the pie? If we don't, let's push it up together. And that's what this dialogue's all about. And that should be maybe just one last, I think it's a thank you slide with the next steps. One more on that. I've said a lot here today. So we have email, we have bill opportunities. I'm proud to be both a director with the WIT here. And thank you again, Dr. Durbach and Excellency and others here.
Thank you, Dr. Rotzen, for a very important and informative presentation. And now it is my pleasure to ask Honorable Carolyn Comita, the state representative of Pennsylvania, who has been with us for many, many years, for her presentation. Honorable Carolyn Comita, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Durbach. And thank you for leading our conference for 28 years now, and for making our young people a cornerstone of the work of World Information Transfer through our internship program, and certainly by welcoming such a wonderful large audience of students each year. So I want to give a shout out to all of the teachers and students who are here, and a special welcome to the students from Chester County, particularly from the Westchester School District and the Westtown School. And a little fun fact is that Henderson High School, Westchester School District, has been in attendance at these conferences since the first conference 28 years ago in 1992. So that's quite right. A great shout out for Henderson. Where's Henderson? Okay, give yourselves a round of applause. Also, just want to point out, as World Information Transfer has focused on young people, we know that our children are our future, that you are shaping a healthy future, and we are here to help you. We are seeing you work with March for Our Lives, Sunrise Movement, fighting the climate crisis, and so on. And WIT is committed to helping empower you to shape a healthy future. So on the Sustainable Development Goals, I selected two that are particularly pertinent to Pennsylvania and our country and world. Sustainable Development Goal 7, affordable and clean energy, and 8, decent work and economic growth. Now, the concern there is that there are some who are concerned that if we move to a cleaner energy future, we are going to lose jobs. And I am here to show you why that is not happening, and that, in fact, a clean energy future is going to be great for family-sustaining jobs. So we know that fossil fuels have been the source of large amounts of greenhouse gases, which are the cause of climate change and certainly are harmful to human health and the environment. And we need to transition to a clean energy in order to avoid the most devastating results of the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So here, as I said, we want clean energy, but we're concerned about the jobs. 88% of Americans support the idea of renewable energy. More than 85% support requiring utilities to produce up to 100% of clean energy by 2050. 58% of Americans think that policies to transition from fossil fuel are going to improve economic growth and create jobs, but many are concerned that we're going to lose jobs. Next slide. So what we have here is a chart that shows that clean energy actually creates growth. Clean energy is an emerging industry, creating jobs. There are already 3.26 million clean energy jobs in America, with 50,000 jobs being created in 2018 alone. In fact, clean energy jobs have outnumbered fossil fuel jobs, new fossil fuel jobs, 3 to 1 in the past year. Next slide. This is the Pennsylvania view of clean energy. Last year, in my district alone, we added 2,200 clean energy jobs. Energy efficiency is the largest clean energy employer in Pennsylvania, with more than 65,000 jobs. More than 8,500 Pennsylvanians work in renewable energy, solar and wind, and 7,000 or so are working in companies that make clean cars, hybrid, electric, and so on. Next slide. Another shout out to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was the first and is one of few states to have an environmental rights amendment, Article 1, Section 27, that basically declares that we all have a right to clean air, clean water, and access to natural resources for the people today and for generations to come. Next slide. So government needs to create policies that will support the transition to clean energy. And some of the things that we're doing is expanding electric vehicle charging stations, upgrading the energy efficiency tax credits for commercial, residential buildings. Actually, energy efficiency for buildings is a huge project. And then research and development for clean energy. And I just introduced a bill that will increase our alternative energy portfolio standards in Pennsylvania from where they are today, 8% by 2021, to 30% by 2030. So it'll be right on the way. Next slide, please. So, in order to combat the damaging effects of the climate crisis, we know that we need to transition away from the harmful fossil fuels towards sustainable clean energy. And as we said, the good news is we can have both. We can achieve both Sustainable Goals 6 and 7, Sustainable Goals, clean energy, and good jobs. And the exciting news about that is that a clean energy future is going to be better for our communities and for our families across Pennsylvania, the United States, and certainly around the world. So thank you again so much, and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Mrs. Kumera, and it has been a great pleasure working with you for those many, many years, and congratulations on your re-election. Our next presenter is Professor Mark Robson, Distinguished Professor at Rutgers University. Dr. Robson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Your Excellencies, Dr. Durbach, friends and colleagues, we will have the express talk on global pesticide use, risks and benefits. Next slide. It's a delicate balance to feed the world and to try to make sure that people have adequate food supply and still maintain a healthy environment. So next slide. When you woke up this morning, there were about 7.7 billion people. When you wake up tomorrow morning, there'll be another 250,000 that weren't here today. By the time that most of our audience, because it's quite young, in 2050, there will be 9 billion people. That is going to be your problem. For the people on the dais, we'll all be dead. It's not our problem, but it's yours. So in the next few minutes, we're going to talk a little bit about agriculture and chemical use and the risks and benefits. We're going to look at some case studies in Southeast Asia and maybe a few things that are competing risks. Next slide. So we have to deliver a healthy food supply. When I first started to teach public health years ago and talk about agriculture and food, we always talked about the 800 million people in the world who are undernourished. And now we'd say a healthy food supply, because now in 2019, we not only talk about still about 800 million people who are not having adequate calories, but there's about 1.4 billion, almost twice as many, who are approaching obesity, overweight, and have unhealthy calories. So it's a delicate balance. The risk for us, though, as people who are involved in agriculture and food production, is what tools do you use to have a positive, beneficial outcome? DDT, after World War II, was hailed as the great silver bullet for agricultural pest control. And then later in 2019, we start to see another silver bullet that was hailed as a great for pest control, Roundup, come and look with serious health problems, long-term cancer risks. DDT, it was brought to our attention by the famous writer Rachel Carson in her book in 1962 when she said, you know, there are endocrine effects from this DDT. DDT does not have acute health effects. In fact, it was used by thousands and thousands of people after World War II to control typhus as people were liberated from prison camps and people liberated from squalor. We still use it around the globe to control malaria, one of the most serious vector diseases in the world. But long-term, it has some serious problems. Next slide. So how are we going to address this? Well, when we look at the global pesticide use over time, it continues to increase. It has become the tool of choice. Next slide. And yet, in many parts of the world, like the picture taken from China, pesticide use is minimal because it's expensive. As economies have more resources, pesticide use will even grow up more. Next slide. And we look at, well, where are the big hot spots for pesticide use? Well, you can see the map is quite clear. The large circles, of course, tell us where the hot spots are, and they're very closely related, with the exception of India, to population centers. Next slide. So we have to build a food system. Actually, you, most of the audience, our young people, have to build a food system to feed these 9 billion people in 2050. Next slide. And right now, we know that about 85% of the world is considered developing countries. About 80% of the people in those developing countries are involved in agriculture. But it's not the agriculture you see whether you go to the central part of Pennsylvania, where Carolyn has lots and lots of agricultural activities in Pennsylvania, or you go to the heartland where you see soybeans and corn with large multi-thousand acre farms. Most of the farms around the world are 1 or 2 hectares, and they're operated with small equipment like this tractor here in Thailand, which is actually considered quite modern. Next slide, because when you go to Burma and you see that the hand tractor hasn't made its way there, most of the agriculture is still animal agriculture. Next slide. And the technology is a bit sometimes interesting. So this picture is taken in the southern part of Vietnam, and I made what was probably an inappropriate comment, and I said to my host, gee, that's pretty primitive to have that scarecrow. And his response is, you don't see any crows, do you? So sometimes the technology is more effective than you think. Next slide. And so what happens when we introduce technology into developing countries and don't provide the training and the stewardship? For most of you in the audience, if you've never driven before and I give you the keys to my car and say, hey, I want you to drive back to New Jersey and take my car back for me. Some of you will get all the way back to New Jersey. Some of you will get out here on First Avenue and, run into something and hopefully, avoid any serious accidents. If I don't train you how to drive the car, I mean, you know how a car operates. We all ride in a car. But if I don't train you on how to drive the car, you're not going to do too well with it. If you introduce a technology like pesticides in the developing world and you sell it on its merits, remember, everything in life has a risk and a benefit, okay? The benefit, of course, is in almost every case you'll get higher yields. You'll control the pests. If you get higher yields, you'll have greater income. If you're a farmer struggling in a developing country, this is really important. So you see the benefits quite rapidly. But then you say, what about the risks? Well, I'm going to overlook those. That long-term you might have, neurological effects or endocrine effects or birth defects in the next generation of folks. Those things tend to be overlooked. How do you train people to use them properly? Well, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of energy. And it's the hard part of this. Adapting the technology and adopting the technology isn't too hard. Training people to use it properly is. This is a farm I visited in Ghana. I had a Ghanaian graduate student. She said, oh, Dr. Robson, I want to take you out and see some farms because I know you want to see that. So off we went. The first farm, by the way, that we went to, the gentleman had only the sprayer on his backpack sprayer on him. He was wearing no clothing, so I didn't take his picture. It's remarkably difficult to have a conversation with a person that's naked. So I went to the next farm, and thankfully this gentleman had some clothes on. But he's spraying the potatoes with a potent organophosphate insecticide. He's wearing, a sleeveless T-shirt, no shoes, just jeans. They're cotton. They absorb the pesticide. And, his role and goal is to kill those potato bugs. So I spoke to the first farmer, the gentleman who wasn't wearing any clothes. I said, I can't help but notice that you're not wearing any clothing. And, Ghana was a British colony, so with beautiful, very proper English, he said, Professor, I tend not to wear clothes when I make pesticide applications because I'm very fearful that the pesticides will damage my clothing. So he removes his clothing, makes the pesticide application, washes up, puts it back on, and goes back into the village. He had a priority. He did his risk assessment. The risk he was most concerned about was damaging his clothes, not necessarily his health. Next slide. So, you see it at one level. And the little case study I'm going to give you very quickly is one in Thailand. In the 1990s, the Thai government said, we want to be the world's largest exporter of rice. Now, China grows much more rice because, of course, there's 1.4 billion people. India grows much more rice. There's 1.3 billion people. Thailand, about 69 million people. But they're actually the world's largest net exporter. And how are they going to do that? They had a fixed amount of land. They had a fixed amount of technology. They introduced high uses of pesticides. When you first look at the application of the pesticide here in this rice paddy, it's kind of remarkable. If you've ever been to the ballet and you watch the coordination and the beautiful moving in and out of the dancers in any ballet, you say, wow, this is so impressive. And I almost felt like I was at the ballet watching this very carefully choreographed application of pesticides. But then the toxicologist in me kicked in and said, holy moly, look at this. This is a potent organophosphate insecticide, and it's just everywhere. Next slide. So, it's everywhere, and it's everywhere in all these different countries. Look at the places where we use lots and lots of pesticide. We use them in places where we grow lots of product, either for food or for fiber. Next slide. So let's look at Thailand. So Thailand said, okay, we're going to start this campaign to export more rice. We're going to import more pesticides. So you can see the graph. It's self-explanatory. Next slide. So they started a few years after that. The Ministry of Health said, we're starting to see pesticide poisonings. We should start to monitor this. And so they were. Next slide. Governments change all around the world, ours here in the U.S. as well as all the other places that we know about. And some governments welcome the opportunity to do monitoring. Other governments don't particularly embrace bad news. So there's a period in time when the government was ordered to stop collecting this data. You can see the missing years. A new government came in 2007, and they started to collect the data again, and it was almost like the numbers didn't change. You could just connect the dots. Those of you that are going to go on to graduate school, you know sometimes you have missing data, you still connect it, you can see the trend. Next slide. And so people realized they had to do something with it. The other challenge we have is who is actually at risk. Many times the people that are applying the applications, making the pesticide applications, are people that often aren't documented, people that have minimal education. In this particular picture, this is a Burmese worker working in the north of Thailand. He is not a documented worker. And I spoke to the farmer who employed him and said, "Aren't you worried about the worker?" The response, in good English, not in Thai, back to me was, "Oh, it's okay. He's Burmese. There are lots of them." So his approach, his risk-benefit calculation was, if this guy gets sick, I can get someone else. Next slide. And so that's been one of the challenges. So in public health, and many of us up on the platform are public health people, we like to ask questions. We like to have surveys. Quickly, here's the little survey we did in Thailand, the English version. And the answer is, what kind of protection do you use when you apply these pesticides? The number one answer was none. That, by the way, that would be the number one answer if you asked it in New Jersey or any other place. But look at some of the other choices. Knitting faces hat, loincloth, things that we know aren't going to provide any protection. Next slide. And so here's a farmer who was in a study we had who absolutely certain that he was protected. He had on a cotton shirt, short sleeves, cotton shorts, no legs, no shoes, and what you and I would consider a ski mask. This was his protective clothing. The ski mask, in fact, is actually of more detriment than if he had no mask on, because cotton, as you know, is absorbent. Those of you that go to the gym, you wear cotton. Why do you wear cotton at the gym? Well, first of all, you look awfully good in cotton when you're on the exercise equipment. But the second reason that you wear it is because it absorbs the sweat. It also would absorb the pesticide. Next slide. And so we work really hard to train farmers and people that use these pesticides on how to reduce it. That's part of the benefit side. Next slide. And what do? When you have groups of folks who typically don't have a lot of formal education, you have to meet them in their own environment, and you have to train them at a level that they will comprehend and understand. I once gave a talk in Bangkok about this, and a European pesticide manufacturer really gave me a hard time. In fact, during the question and answer period, I would almost say he attacked me. "You're vilifying us. You're making us look like bad people. Why are you doing this? We give everyone a label." I said, "My friend, what language did you give them?" Well, the label was in English, and it was also in French. But of course, these folks spoke neither. And they don't even read or write their own language in many cases. So you have to bring people in and train them. Next slide. You have to make it practical and help them understand where the risks are for them on their small piece of land. Next slide. And that can mean building little dioramas. This is my favorite farmer. We took what we had at the health clinic and had people construct the dioramas. Engage people. That way it becomes real to them. You'll note this gentleman claimed to have had an elephant at his farm. I went 3 times, I never saw an elephant, but I had to believe him. Next slide. So what do? It has to be a community-engaged approach. Dr. Ratson talked about the communication aspect. The communication aspect is much more important than the toxicology, is much more important than the medicine, because it's the way that we get people to change. Quickly, this is a little story, next slide, of maize farmers in the north of Thailand and how to engage them. We knew we could not put people in expensive protective clothing. First of all, it's too hot there. They'd have heat exhaustion almost instantly. Secondly, they couldn't afford it. It wouldn't be sustainable. And thirdly, people just weren't keen on it. So what we did is instead we found the minimum that would work, a respirator that's appropriate, goggles, gloves, and a hat. Next slide. We had a public relations campaign with a poster written in plain language that people understood and put it in every home in this small village. Next slide. And we had a sort of a real aggressive communications campaign. In very remote parts of Thailand, there is no television or radio. People have cell phones, but they don't have internet access. So we had billboards, and then you'll see the lady on the far side where she's actually reading, at lunchtime they read the news in the village, and we had her make public service announcements about reducing exposure to pesticides. Next slide. And so that's how we go forward, to make it reasonable, to make it practical, to make it understandable. Next slide. Now, the other thing that often takes place, and we tend to forget, is who else is at risk in the field, not just the farmer and the farm worker, next slide, but also the children. Children are working at a very young age, at 14, but before that, 0 to 14, they're with mama and papa in the field. You can see at the edge of the field, in the middle of the field, or my little nudist here at the top. who, despite his mother's best efforts, just wouldn't wear any clothing. So his exposure literally was quite high. Next slide. So quick little study we did. We went ahead and measured pesticides, did urinary metabolites because it's easy to measure pesticides in urine and it's not very invasive. And we had the light gray bars are kids who are in the farm with mama and papa. The dark gray bars are kids who live in the village and aren't engaged in farming. Next slide. So you see the high levels in the previous one during the rainy season when there was no pesticide application, the levels were the same. Clearly, the little ones were getting exposed to pesticides. You have to educate mom and pop that this is a long-term risk to their children. Next slide. And the other part of this is to look at it in an integrated approach to see how people use the pesticides and where the risk points are. Next slide. Which includes, in many cases, watching how people work. When you do environmental medicine and occupational medicine, and several of our colleagues are involved in that as physicians, they ask the farmer, what do you do? Or the worker, whatever the worker is, what do you do? And how do you do it? We didn't know how people caught the fish. We didn't have any data. We took U.S. risk assessment papers over to a place where it was totally inappropriate. You know, it would be like taking a winter coat to Thailand. It's just absolutely inappropriate. So we had graduate students go out and watch what people did and make observations, next slide, and try to understand how people caught the fish, how much they caught, next slide, and to try and understand what the risk was. We found out that one of the risks to pesticide exposure wasn't the application of the pesticide. It was the accumulation of some of these pesticides in the meals that people ate. So we asked people, what did you eat? And people couldn't tell us. You know, but if you do that in the United States, people can't tell you. You can usually say, what did you have for breakfast today? But I've asked Dr. Durbach, what did she have 3 days ago? Well, Dr. Durbach would be able to tell you because she's very particular. But if I asked the rest of the panel, they wouldn't be able to tell me what they had for breakfast 3 days ago. The other thing is that people routinely misrepresent the amount that they intake by about 300%. So my friends who are nutritionists tell you that most of the time, people misrepresent their dietary intake by 300%. Our Thai people were no different. So we did this beautiful little study for 2 weeks and asked our farmers to measure and record everything they ate. And they did 54 families for 2 weeks, and guess what? It was 311%, so the 300 matches. Next slide. As we get to the end of this picture, I want to talk about the last little part, which is looking at kids. Next slide. So we decided these are the kids at risk because they consume the food. Next slide. They are going to school and walking past these rice paddies every day on their way to their village. Next slide. And so we want to go ahead and understand exactly what their risk is. Next slide. And so we monitored kids over time to see what their pesticide exposure was through a series of neurological assessments. Next slide. And, you know, they're the standard tests. We use tests that you use around the world, so you could compare children from Italy with children from Thailand with children from Canada. Next slide. And it worked out pretty well. These are a standard little battery of tests that you use. Next slide. And it's fun, and it's sort of a universal test. Next slide. So as we come into the home stretch, we're able to correlate the results of those tests with the neurological battery on the computer with people's urinary samples. Next slide. So the plan as you go ahead is, what are the alternatives? Dr. Durbach said, talk about risks and benefits. The last little part of this is, one place, and a big place, decided they're going to reduce pesticide use. You go, that's exciting. It's China. Next slide. So the Chinese farmers decided instead they're going to go GMO, which is another whole talk for another different time. So China said we're going to use GMOs. This is GMO in cotton. Cotton is the world's largest user of pesticides. Chinese government said it's expensive, it's dangerous, we're going to use GMOs. Next slide. And they're also going to use GMOs on corn. Next slide. And so they started to work aggressively with farmers to understand how they use the pesticides. Graduate students helping them record their use. Next slide. And actually understand what the products are. Next slide. And they, nope, you went too fast. Go back. So there was a wonderful demonstration on the part of the farmers that showed that the people who use GMOs actually have far more income and far less risk. And you can see this. If they only use GMO cotton, they went ahead and they had absolutely no risk. If they used the pesticide, they didn't. So as we come to the very last part of the slide, next, and then we're done, this is the goal, to get people to try an integrated approach. And the final slide should be that the challenge is yours. The challenge is yours. It's to reduce the use of pesticides. It's to find better tools to grow more food and to find more food for these extra 3 billion people that are going to be here by the time you're my age. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Robson, for a very important presentation. Since we all eat, I hope you paid very good attention to it, the presentation. And now I would like to remind you, we do not take questions from the floor. The questions need to be written down. The monitors will pick up your questions, and we will answer as many questions as time permits. Our next presenter is Katerina Pavlova, head of the International Affairs of Ukraine on Exclusion Zone Management. Ms. Pavlova, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, dear colleagues and guests, I'm pleased to be here today. Thank you, Christina Durbak, to having me today here. My name is Katerina Pavlova. I'm a head of International Cooperation and Public Relations Department of the State Agency of Ukraine on Exclusion Zone Management. As you all know, Chernobyl disaster is a technical, ecological, and humanitarian catastrophe caused by two thermal explosions of the first power unit of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant at night of April 26, 1986. The reactor was completely destroyed, and a large amount of radioactive substance was released into the environment, namely strontium and uranium elements. The catastrophe is considered to be the largest in the history of nuclear energy. As a result, now Ukraine takes the second place in Europe and the first in the world by the amount of radioactive waste. In this regard, our state puts an important role on our agency in long-term storage and disposal of radioactive waste. In Ukraine, State Agency of Exclusion Zone Management is a central exclusive body responsible for strategic directions as follows. Exclusion zone management, overcoming the consequences of Chernobyl accident, Chernobyl nuclear power plant decommissioning and transformation of the shelter object into ecology safe system, state management in the area of radioactive waste management, and the storage of the long-term storage and disposal. Talking about the high-level coordination of our activity, it is important to know that we are coordinated by Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine through the Minister of Ecology. The Chernobyl exclusion zone is the area that has forbidden for free access and has been heavily contaminated by long-lived radionuclides. As of today, the territory is divided into... Back, please. One slide. As of today, the territory is divided into main parts. The 10-kilometer zone is a territory of special industrial use, specially created to place there the facilities of renewable energy and storage for radioactive waste. And the 30-kilometer zone, whereby the degree of the present Chernobyl radiation and ecological biosphere reserve was created. The territory of special industrial use, so-called 10-kilometer zone, which is around Chernobyl nuclear power plant, will be able using the highly contaminated territory to enhance the mechanism of radioactive waste management and create the appropriate infrastructure. There is a number of facilities within the territory designed to store and process radioactive waste. The creation in 1986 of the shelter object of the destroyed first power unit protected the environment from radiation dissemination and people, primarily who work in Chernobyl nuclear power plant site, from contamination. The shelter object has been performed and its protective function for more than 30 years. So the decision was taken to build a new construction to protect people and the environment for longer period, namely new safe confinement. As of today, the construction of new safe confinement, which is the biggest mobile, is completed and moved about the first destroyed unit. The new safe confinement will serve 100 years. Now I'm going to tell you more about 30-kilometer zone, which has renewed itself within 33 years period after Chernobyl disaster. What a miracle! Created within 30 kilometers exclusion zone, the largest reserve in Ukraine is a basis for extremely important and unique nature experiment, not only in my country, but also in the world. Despite the fact that exclusion zone has suffered incredible losses, now it is the center of amazing animal and plant world, we can deny that nature is much more powerful even than such terrible anthropogenic factors in the Chernobyl catastrophe. According to the science, there can be more than 400 species of animals, birds, and fish included to Red Book of Ukraine that need our protection. To date, 300 species have already been identified. 66 species include to Red Book of Ukraine. From 2018, the Chernobyl Radiation and Environment Biosphere Reserve actively participate in the international project and organize the first scientific expedition to study the flora and fauna of the exclusion zone territory. We can define the main goals: preservation of the most typical nature complex of Polysia in the natural state, ensure support and increase the barrier function of the Chernobyl exclusion zone, remediation of the area contaminated of radionuclides, and stabilization of its hydrological regime. The main tasks are as follows: conducting scientific research in the field of environment protection, maintenance of reserve territory with all nature objects, preservation of landscape nature diversity, the gain pool of animal, world, and vegetation, monitoring the overall ecological balance, organization and conduction of international scientific research, conducting of ecological and education work. A part of the marvels of nature in the exclusion zone, there is also culture and historical heritage there. Next slide, please. Yes. For example, antique churches, monuments, and sites which belong to different historic epochs, in total around 200 objects. Of course, we must protect nature, heritage, and facilities and be responsible for their safety. In this regard, one of the problems we face today is the fires in exclusion zone. Due to the existence of red forest spot and exclusion zone, there is a huge risk of fire. That's why we control and monitor the situation, especially during the summertime. The consequences of the fire are quite serious, taking into account that the territory is contaminated with radionuclides. By the way, we have a joint project together with Belarus under the US Forest Service support on the protection of these territories from fire and early fire detection. In Ukraine, we use a RODOS system for making prognosis and control over radionuclides dissemination due to emergencies, fires, and floods. This slide shows the existing station and fire station planned to be built. The 24-hour monitoring system operating in exclusion zone provides radiation measurements in the air, soil, and water. The monitoring system in the regular mode is updated once an hour and in emergency situation every 2 minutes. This system consists of 39 monitoring pods. The state specialized enterprise eco center provides the control, having a modern laboratory. I would also like you to know that we also developed some new direction, such as organizing of scientific visit to the exclusion zone and provide unique training course. For example, we propose training program which involves gaining knowledge from safety assessment of the nuclear installation, principles of radioactive waste and spent nuclear fuel management, overcoming the consequences of the accident of the nuclear installations, remediation of contaminated environment. The topic of lecture are different, as you may see from this slide, and of course, all participants receive certificates. In March this year, 36 British program participants, nuclear graduate of the British company NGOs, employees in the field of nuclear industry passed 2 days training course on the consequences elimination of the disaster at the nuclear power plant. The internship purpose was to familiarize with the nuclear industry aspects in other countries, include technical, social, and public factors that had an impact on the environment. Another interesting training proposed to our Chinese colleague was held in May and September last year. The aim was to get acquainted with the issues of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident cases and consequences, modern Ukrainian radiation monitoring system, and the radioactive waste management, as well as the nuclear safety culture. So, as far as you may see, visiting the exclusion zone is possible, but not only with the education purpose. Of course, we prefer not to call this tourism. Starting from 2010, with the aim of informing public at large about the consequences of the largest technological accident, a decision was taken to conduct the scientific visit. Government develop and adopt rules for visitors on visiting the zone. Visits in the zone have become more and more popular. This slide shows how popular the exclusion zone was last year as compared with 2014. By the way, the enterprises under agency permanently developed the infrastructure for providing service to visitors, the information center, a few hotels, and cafeteria. Next slide present different countries from where people come: the Great Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, Poland, the USA, Sweden, and many, many others. The infrastructure and implementation of alternative energy projects in the exclusion zone and consider a new stage of overcoming the consequences of the accident. Today in the Chernobyl zone, there are huge territories that are permanently removed from agriculture production. The infrastructure of power transmission lines is also very developed. It is extremely important for investors to make sure that the network connection will be provided. Starting from 2016, the Ministry of Ecology, together with our agency, carried out a complex of measures aimed at sustainable development of green energy in the exclusion zone. This year, we are planning to launch 35-megawatt wind station. The investor for which is Wind Power Polisia. October last year, and the industrial site of Chernobyl nuclear power plant official opening ceremony of 1-megawatt solar power plant. Chernobyl is the first nuclear power plant in Ukraine, the first one to start the decommissioning process, the first nuclear power plant where large-scale international projects are being implemented. Today, we are the first nuclear power plant on which site alternative energy is generated. I think it's very positive that the station again has electricity power and they give green energy. The agency will continue to work on the transformation of Chernobyl from black point to green. We are trying to step up data providing our activities in relation to the exclusion zone. Due to the creation of the Chernobyl Radiation and Ecological Biosphere Reserve, in order to reduce the anthropogenic load on the ecosystem, the following is being worked out. The project of replacement of motor vehicles on ecological electric. a draft program for the for placement of special electric refueling and service station for electric buses. In September 2018, we made a huge process, first Ukrainian exhibition on Chernobyl's theme in the framework of the General Conference in IAEA, with the involvement of stakeholders. This is the history now, and I'm happy that my colleagues and I are part of this history. The contribution of the international community in terms of efforts to overcome the consequences of Chernobyl disaster is important and considerable. Our agency provides close cooperation with international organizations and countries to strengthen the non-proliferation regime of radioactive materials. IAEA, NATO, European Commission, G7 Global Partnership, USA, United Kingdom, Sweden, Japan, and others. As a traditional, I usually finish my presentation with these words. Do you know who is the symbol of wild nature in the exclusion zone? When in the exclusion zone, if you are lucky, you might come across the symbol of all the animals of Chernobyl, the fox named Simeon. He's even got his page on Facebook. Dear colleagues and delegates, dear guests, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Pavlova, for a very important update on disaster and what comes if people leave the area alone. I find that fascinating personally. Our next presenter is Dr. Meshkati, who's a fellow from Harvard University. Dr. Meshkati, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rubik. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, particularly my young friends and students, and His Excellency Yatchenko and my dear colleagues in the podium here. It's really indeed a pleasure for me to be here to present my research in the last almost 40 years in the field of complex system safety. And I chose that subtitle of Thinking About Unthinkable because what you see I'm going to be talking about is a cross-cutting problem. It applies to nuclear power plants. I started my research at 3 Mile Island exactly 40 years ago, Chernobyl, and also it applies to other chemical plants and complex technological systems like the Bhopal accident that happened in 1984. Next slide, please. I just want to tell you my life story very briefly. Next one, please. I got involved, and please go through that all the time because I don't have time to, all the way to 2000. Perfect. Yes, keep it there. I got involved in the 3 Mile Island accident 40 years ago because it was attributed to human error. Bhopal accident, the same thing. It killed 2,000 people, injured 200,000. And after 30 years, its death toll reached to 16,000 people. Of course, the Chernobyl accident, that's what we are here for and we are talking about. I was involved in the investigation of the BP refinery explosion in 2005. BP Deepwater Horizon, I was a member of the national panel investigating that, and also Fukushima accident. Next one, please. I have been working with all these industries in the last 40 plus years and with the healthcare industry because you may have heard about wrong site surgery, wrong medication, wrong dosage, and that. The ingredients of that and root causes of these accidents, they have a lot in common with each other. That's what I'm going to get to that. Next one, please. And I've worked with 10 nuclear power plants in US and across the world, and then conducted research on a few more that is listed over here. And these 10 nuclear power plants, I've been there. I have done work on them. Again, I'm not an armchair general. Next one, please. This is the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant. I am with my mentor, the late Professor Alphonse Japanese. Next one. This is, of course, the Chernobyl nuclear plant that had the accident in 86, and I visited that in 1997. I am in front of sarcophagus. Next one, please. And this is a photo that my students, they like it a lot. They say, my haircut and looks very much like the head of Lenin over there. I mean, I heard that from my students over there. This is the corridor that runs from the administration building in the Chernobyl nuclear power station to the 4 reactors. Reactor number 4 was the exploded one. At the end of the hallway, I visited reactor number 3, control room when it was operational. Next one, please. Next one. Yes, this is the control room of reactor number 3. It was operational, and as you see, the poor soul on the left is a little overwhelmed with the design of that control panel, because this is against every principles of human factors, and they have done much better since the Chernobyl time. When we talk about single sensor, single indicator, and human machine interface related issue, which is my area of research. Next one, please. I'm in the chair of the shift supervisor, again in reactor number 3. I learned a lot from my Ukrainian friends and colleagues over there. That 2 days at Chernobyl was one of my best days, Ms. Katrina, and that's what I want to return to Chernobyl. This is another nuclear plant in Japan that's called Mihama that had an accident in 1992. I don't have time to explain that, but I spent a lot of time over there. This next one, please. This is the Mihama. Next one. This is Fukushima Daiichi. I was a member of the National Academy. The gentleman or the guy that in a Tyvek suit and face mask is me. And this is something that I don't want to see again. I don't want to see that in my lifetime again. I've been to Chernobyl. I've been to Fukushima. We cannot afford the third one. And that's why the balance of my talk is how to prevent another major catastrophic accident like these two. And this is my message for the young people over here. You are the future. You should work on preventing the third catastrophic accident. And please listen to me. Next one. This is another nuclear plant. I did a lot of work on that. That's EBR-2 reactor, experimental breeder reactor 2 in Idaho Falls. Next one. Now let's look at the common denominator of all these accidents that I talk all the way from 3 Mile Island to BP Deepwater Horizon. And some of this stuff that I talk about applies also to the grounding of the 737. You may say why, you will see why. Please go to the next one. And yeah, these are human factors and safety culture related cross-cutting issues. That's what I want you to remember, this fact. These are cross-cutting. Next one, please. I developed a model which is called HOT model, Human Organization Technology Interaction. Next one, please. And then, yes, push that. And another one. Please keep it there. As you see over here, I say that every complex technological system, any large-scale complex technological system, can be decomposed to the combination of these 3 subsystems. Human subsystem, the operators and maintainers and the human element. The organizational subsystem is that entity that takes care of the recruiting, training. It takes care of the preventive medicine, corrective medicine, training, and all of that. And then there is a technological subsystem. All these 3, they are like 3 links in a chain. And reliability and safety is equivalent to that I be able to carry this weight day in and day out. A system failure and accident when you drop the load. And the system failure and accident happens when one of these links breaks down. In that case, my message is we need, in order to keep the link intact, as you heard that a link breaks down at its weakest, a chain breaks down at its weakest link, sorry. A chain breaks down at its weakest link, or a chain is as strong as its weakest link. That's why we need to give equal and adequate attention. These accidents that I mentioned to you, they are all happened because this balance, this equilibrium was not maintained. Next one, please. I think you jumped on one. Maybe you want to go back. Yes, and push one more. Okay. There was another one that I have, it's not there. In the case of the 3 Mile Island, this is the statement. This was the accident happened in Pennsylvania. the distinguished lady on the panel is from that area. This is a report from the Presidential Commission about the importance of safety culture in the 3 Mile Island. And you will see this theme is being repeated again. Safety culture, human error. And that has been my research interest for the last 40 years. Please look at that red segment over there. The principal deficiency in commercial nuclear reactor safety today are not hardware problems, but they are management problems, safety culture problems. That statement was made in 1980. Next one, please. In the case of the Chernobyl, next one, please. This is a report by the International Atomic Energy Agency called INSAC. INSAC stands for International Nuclear Safety Advisory Group. And again, look at those highlighted words in red. This is a report by the INSAC when they went to investigate Chernobyl. It was when the late academician Valery Legazov was still alive. Then he committed suicide on the 2nd anniversary of Chernobyl. By the way, I want to commemorate this academician Valery Legazov, who was a very decent and a fantastic scientist. He died 31 years ago today by committing suicide because of Chernobyl. Safety culture, as you see, this is a quote from International Atomic Energy Agency. Next one, please. And this is the report that highlighted the term safety culture. That's a photo of Dr. Hans Blix, former Director General of International Atomic Energy Agency, who turned 90 years old this year. And this is a very seminal report that Dr. Blix wrote a preface, said that also applies to the other systems and other technologies. And it is intended to stimulate discussion in the nuclear safety. Next one, please. And another report by International Atomic Energy Agency talks about the importance of root causes of Chernobyl being in human element. Again, remember that 2 links in that chain, human subsystem and organizational subsystem. Next one, please. And these are a few other statements about Chernobyl, because today's conference is, of course, on a commemoration of Chernobyl, about the importance of human factors, the importance of human-machine system. And then, as you see that I have a quote from late academician Valery Legazov over there. He developed a lot of respect for this stuff that I'm talking about, which I'm very honored to see that such a distinguished late person said that. Next one, please. Now I want to take you to Fukushima. Again, I have many slides on Fukushima, but I'm going to go through that very fast. Fukushima, next one, please. As you see that this is an aerial photo of Fukushima before the accident. It had 6 reactors, 4 of them were operational during the time. Next one. This is a complicated slide, but I just want to tell you that Fukushima happened because of this. There was an earthquake. Of course, all of us, we know that. Nuclear power plants are designed to shut down after the earthquake, and they shut down. But then the tsunami came after 45 minutes and inundated the plant. And then we have emergency diesel generators so that to cool down the reactors. But because of the inundation of the plant, some of these emergency diesel generators, they got inundated, they couldn't work, and we had what is called a station blackout. This is the most catastrophic thing that could happen in a nuclear plant. Again, sorry, I don't have time to go over that, but Fukushima was not an act of God. Fukushima was preventable. Fukushima was preventable. Next one, please. Next one. This is the title of a report that came out from Carnegie, why Fukushima was preventable. There have been better reports than that came later on. In fact, one article in Royal Society magazine is called Fukushima Was Preventable. And can you push one more? Yeah. This is my colleague, Dr. George Apostolakis, who was a commissioner with Nuclear Regulatory Commission. He said the accident was not extremely low probability. It was not unthinkable or unfeasible or unpreventable. And next one, please. This is a copy of a first page of a Japan Parliament report about Fukushima. Next one. This is the cartoon that was published in the International Herald Tribune when this report was published. On the left is Dr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa, my mentor, who was the chair of this commission. As you see, the industry people and all government, and that they point fingers to each other, to blame each other for that. Next one, please. This is one of the most seminal pieces. This is Dr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa's preface on that report. You can't read that, but 4 places in that preface, he said Fukushima happened because of the mindset in Japan. Fukushima, he says, was an accident made in Japan. This is a very revealing report. Again, he was the head of the independent commission investigated Fukushima on behalf of Japanese parliament. And he's a very authoritative report. Next one, please. There are some excerpts from him. Next one. Again, he said that these are quotes from his reports, which was almost like 800 pages. Thank you. Fukushima was profoundly man-made, and it was have been foreseeable, and it could have been prevented. Next one. Keep it there, please. And again, he says that the Japan nuclear industry managed to avoid absorbing the lessons from 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. See, learning lessons from past is very important, at least in the case of Fukushima. That's what I would like us to concur and agree upon that. Next one, please. And it was the mindset and that. Okay, you may go through that report of government of ministerial thing and that. Just go. Next one, please. Don't have time for that. Next one. Next one. Next one. Okay. This is a very important thing. I mentioned to you, yes, go through that. Very good. Okay, stop there. We talk about 3 Mile Island, happened in 1979, but there was an accident, another nuclear reactor, which is called stationary reactor number 1. That happened before that in 1961. What you see over there when 3 Mile Islands happened in 1979, many people, they refer to that accident. And again, those areas in red, you see that. They said that we should have paid attention to this management factor, human factors, organizational factors over there. Bhopal happened in 74, then we moved to Chernobyl in 86. You see Valery Legazov said that we should have learned from Bhopal. And then fast forward to 2011, Kiyoshi Kurokawa said in his report that we should have learned from 3 Mile Island, from Chernobyl for Fukushima. My point is, in year 20XY, would we say that we should have learned from SL1, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima for the next nuclear accident, or we have got enough learning? Next one, please. And the last word, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat that. This is by George Santayana. Next one. This is a book that came out last year by my good friend, Professor Sirki Polikhiv. For those of you that are interested in Chernobyl, I strongly recommend you to read and buy this book. He's a Harvard professor, director of Ukrainian Institute at Harvard. What Sergei says, this is a very important thing. While world attention is focused on the non-proliferation and that, we need to strengthen our international collaboration and cooperation. And then he also says that, next one, please. And the most crucial lesson that Chernobyl told us is the importance of counteracting the danger posed by nuclear nationalism. And then, of course, the issue of populism, nationalism, and anti-globalism that we are dealing with in our neighborhood here. And next one. And then I think this is a very important thing, and I want to end with that statement by Sergei, that the world has experienced one nuclear accident at Chernobyl, another one at Fukushima. The reason I put Persian Gulf over there, because there are 4 nuclear reactors in Abu Dhabi, and one in Iran, and they will be building more nuclear reactors in that area. Right now, ladies and gentlemen, we have 450 nuclear reactors in the world. 450. There are 55 more under construction. That makes it 500. And there are 4 countries that are newcomers: Belarus, Bangladesh, Turkey, United Arab Emirates. And there are some other countries like Jordan and Egypt that are going to build one. This is the lesson of Chernobyl that I would like to leave it with you, that we have to work hard to prevent the next Chernobyl. And I'm so happy to see such a young generation over here. I hope that you got the message. Thank you for your attention.
And thank you, Professor Mascari, for a very important information regarding the need for safety for the current and the new nuclear reactors, particularly because of the energy potential that they can help us in our endeavor to control the climate change. Our next presenter is Ms. Oksana Leshchenko, Policy Specialist at the United Nations Department.
Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, let me start by thanking the World Information Transfer, Dr. Durbach, the organizers, for convening this important meeting. I've been participating in these conferences over the last 10 years, so this is not the first time. Thank you very much. And today I will be speaking from the side of UNDP on UNDP's work on development and mine action. UNDP has supported mine action initiatives since 1993, when we launched our first program in Cambodia. Since then, UNDP has supported mine action in over 40 countries. In close cooperation with civil society, donors, and our UN partners, we have focused on capacity building of member states, governments, and linking mine action centrally to our core mandate of UNDP, and that is development. So this commitment was seen particularly in 2016, when UNDP launched its Development and Mine Action Strategic Framework. And this framework focuses on 3 main areas, which are, all of them are in line with the Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development Goals. First of all, we are focusing on translating mine action into sustainable development dividends. Mainly, we are linking mine action to job creation, livelihoods, food security, water, and sanitation. For example, in Lebanon, more than 68 square kilometers of land have been cleared just in 2018, and this impacted positively livelihoods in almost 300 villages. And moreover, around 97% of cleared land has been put to immediate socio-economic use. In Cambodia and in Lao PDR, the national SDG 18 on mine action was officially declared, with substantive support from UNDP. Our second priority is strengthening national institutions that accelerate development benefits for countries and people affected by landmines. For example, in Azerbaijan, we supported setting up a fully functioning mine action agency, which integrated sustainable development considerations and now shares its experiences with other countries, including Afghanistan, Turkey, and others. Our third priority is supporting international normative frameworks on mine action. UNDP has been at the forefront of advocating for and supporting the universalization and implementation of a number of normative frameworks, such as Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, Convention on Cluster Munition, and others. This has contributed to landmine-free countries such as Albania, Jordan, Mozambique, and Uganda, which declared themselves free of known minefields and meeting demining obligations under the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention. Next slide, please. Later, in 2017, UNDP and the Geneva Center for Humanitarian Demining conducted a study called Leaving No One Behind, Mine Action and the Sustainable Development Goals. This study demonstrated direct and indirect links between mine action and the whole range of sustainable development goals. For example, releasing land not only has direct impacts on reducing violence and fear, which is SDG 16, but it is also seen as an indirect accelerator for several other SDGs, including SDG 1 on poverty, SDG 2 on hunger, SDG 3 on healthy lives, and SDG 8 on inclusive growth. So you can see on this slide, there are all these really complex interlinkages between mine action and SDGs. Some of them are direct, others are indirect. And now we are using this study to design mine action policy and programs within the context of SDG implementation in our program countries. Next slide. Also, our work on development and mine action is fully aligned with the priorities of the new UN strategy on mine action for 2019-2023, and particularly in the areas of socioeconomic impact of landmines, developing national capacities, victim assistance, and linking mine action to the achievement of the SDGs. UNDP has the integrator role, and now we are also trying to aiming to use mine action as a vehicle for advancing the humanitarian development peace nexus and responding to the overarching goal of leaving no one behind. So what does it mean in practical terms of linking mine action to the overarching goal of leaving no one behind? It means that mine action will support local communities in rebuilding after conflict and putting them back on track of the road for development. The integrated approach also allows us to face the newly emerging challenges, such as forced displacement, resulting in a record number of refugees and internally displaced persons. In Syria, for example, the level of explosive hazardous contamination posed by landmines and exploded ordnances is staggering. So we are witnessing how mine action can be an enabler for creating safe spaces in the affected communities, such as in Syria, where after mine action takes place, we can launch emergency job programs, local area development initiatives, reconstruction of damaged infrastructure, so on and so forth. Finally, our obligation and our commitments are, and our implementation of our mandate is, of course, not possible if we are alone. We are as strong as our partners are. Next slide, please. Only working with our partners and national counterparts, we can be assured that we can achieve our dream toward the world free of landmines. Our main partners here at the UN level are members of the UN Interagency Coordination Group on Mine Action, which is coordinated by the UN Mine Action Service, as well as a number of other UN agencies, including UNDP, which is development arm of the United Nations. At the country level, we work with the national mine action centers and other authorities. We work very closely with the civil society organizations, which enable people's participation on the ground. And also we work with international NGOs, such as Geneva International Center for Humanitarian Demining, Halo Trust, MAIG, and NPA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oksana, for a wonderful presentation and giving us an update on the United Nations Development Program and how you progress from one area to another, always giving us new informative information. Our next presenter is Shoshana Fisher. She is security consultant, has an some conflict resolution from Columbia University. And Ms. Fisher, you have the floor.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Durbach, World Information Transfer, and the United Nations for hosting us. As you've heard here today, World Information Transfer and members of our distinguished panel are working on important issues related to the environment and public health, both fundamental aspects of achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Today I'm going to talk about another element related to sustainable development, conflict resolution, and our ability to create a safer world. I would like us to consider a word that is echoed often throughout these hallways and meeting rooms. It is a word that means something different to everyone, depending on where you live or what you do. I would like to talk to you about security, specifically how ensuring safe spaces at a local grassroots level impacts our communities, and more broadly, how what the UN calls human security is a fundamental framework for sustainable development. I would also like to discuss how gender inclusion is critical for both. Among many hats I've worn in my career, one of them is a black hoodie, there's a picture of me in a black hoodie, if you couldn't tell. In addition to being the vice president of marketing at the Big Apple Circus, right across town at Lincoln Center, I'm a licensed New York security guard, one of the few women working without accreditation in nightlife. My personal story covers a lot of different pursuits. I was an activist in college. I was a student member of the Oregon State Board of Higher Education. I was student body president. I'm sure that these are all things that the students in here will be doing in college, which I recommend doing student government. After graduation, I was a legislative aide to the Oregon Speaker of the House. But I always wanted to live in New York, so I moved here on my own, jobless, and worked my way up through a variety of positions in theater and entertainment, ultimately leading to my work with the Big Apple Circus. The area that I found most interesting in live entertainment is my work in security. Over the last 5 years, I've worked with numerous security teams in New York in large and small venues. I've always thought the word venue is interesting because these spaces are more like communities than anything else. Thousands of people filter in and out each day to meet, work, and create memories. As a security professional, it is my goal to keep these spaces safe and to prevent conflict before it begins. I have found that an intersectional approach to security is rarely, if ever, practiced, but when used, increases the likelihood of resolving conflict. Because of this, I'm pursuing my master's in conflict resolution at Columbia University, as Dr. Durbach mentioned, with an emphasis on researching how we apply conflict resolution to issues of security, both person to person and from a global perspective. In my current role at a multi-million-dollar touring entertainment company, in addition to programming compelling experiences, our priority is that audiences should always feel safe and respected as well as being entertained. At the Big Apple Circus, safe space starts with our messaging. We want the circus to be accessible and inclusive for all. We have community programming with enhanced shows for audience members with disabilities, and we work hard to train our staff to welcome everyone with open arms. While the nightlife venues I work in certainly cater to a different audience, the priority is the same. Oh, that's me working in a nightlife venue. Making sure they are safe spaces for all. A security guard's ability to de-escalate conflict is crucial to everyone's safety. The tools of conflict resolution, active listening, reframing, negotiation, and de-escalation are the difference between a dangerous or safe night for the patrons, the guards, and the venue. As we walked into this incredibly historic and important building today, we of course had to go through a security check. I would like all of us to think back to that for a second and ask yourselves, how many of the guards that checked you in today were women? And regardless of where they are in the gender spectrum, how did that interaction make you feel? Was there a difference? If so, why? Imagine a world in which more of the people who protected us looked more like us in every sense. While I've worked with nightlife security teams for many years, I wasn't a licensed guard until recently. Despite identifying problem patrons, de-escalating conflict, getting garbage thrown at me because it's New York, or in one especially dangerous instance, having a gun flashed, I did not get my security license until just last year. I thought because most security guards I saw don't look like me, that what I was doing was hospitality, was rather than security. We do not often see women in positions related to the word security. I would like to discuss two areas of security in which a lack of inclusion across the spectrum of gender identity is lacking so severely, I believe it leaves us in danger as individuals, both in our local communities and at the world at large. The first area is the field of private security that I work in and have discussed. Unlike publicly funded local police forces or the federal TSA, private security is not subject to government regulations for diversity goals or standards of inclusion. The security guards or bouncers we see at most private establishments are men. Depending on the venue, they may be men society has stereotyped as being imposing or scary for a variety of reasons, the worst of which are discriminatory and at best undervalue the very tactics of conflict resolution we have that has the best chance of de-escalating conflict before it gets physical. Surprisingly, the training required to obtain a New York State security guard license does not cover tactics of conflict resolution whatsoever. The second area of security I would like to discuss is a concept the UN World Development Program put forth about 25 years ago, which focuses on security as it relates to individual well-being. The concept is called human security, which the UN has identified as a central framework to accelerate the progress of the Sustainable Development Goals. Human security challenges the traditional notion of national security by arguing that the priority should be at the human rather than the national level. Gary Lewis, the Director of Policy and Programs at UN Environment, I think there's a quote from Gary on here, makes the connection between the degradation of the environment and the conditions which spill over into domestic threats, directly impacting our human security. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres equates human security as a requirement to national and global security. The next slide is a UN graphic showing the elements of human security as they support the Sustainable Development Goals. People-centered, preventative, comprehensive, and context-specific. But this slide could just as easily, if you want to click to this really cool graphic design, could also describe the most effective approach to the kind of security we encounter on a daily basis. As we walked into the UN today, in malls, at the door to a nightclub, restaurants, and all live entertainment events. More needs to be done to promote these concepts in both private and global security. In addition to the importance of an individual's safety and protection, one of the primary commonalities between the work being done regarding human security and the security field I have worked in is the lack of gender inclusion represented in both creating and enforcing solutions that may lead to a more secure world. Just a few months ago in Austria, the UN held a workshop on applying a gender lens to science, technology, and innovation, also known as STEM. Scientists and technologists are on the front lines of securing our environment. According to the UN report, globally, the share of female researchers in STEM is just 29%. The lack of gender inclusion in STEM fields has real-life consequences that affect not only our daily lives, but actually jeopardize a healthier and safer future. One well-known example is how women are more vulnerable in car accidents because seatbelts were designed for the larger human body, which is men typically are on average are taller and heavier. Similarly, women's health issues have also been neglected. Medicines and treatments are often developed without full consideration of how their effects will vary on the gender spectrum. In addition to the STEM fields, there is a lack of gender inclusion in the field of conflict resolution and mediation, which I am currently studying. Like STEM researchers, those who are involved in diplomatic and security negotiations are on the front lines of making our world a safer space. One study found that a substantial inclusion of women in peace negotiation makes the resulting agreement 64% less likely to fail, and according to another study, 35% more likely to last at least 15 years. Police data shows female officers are more likely to resolve conflicts without the use of force or being accused of excessive force, despite being met with the same or higher rates of force as male officers. I can also say anecdotally that this is something that I find to be true. Through my work in security and research at Columbia, I have come to realize the importance of conflict resolution at an interpersonal, local, and global level. If we're going to accomplish human security, we must incorporate an intersectional and gender-inclusive approach to conflict resolution in STEM fields. Women are needed in the fields that are meant to protect us, whether it be the security or the environment. Just 18% of private protection officers are women. Much like the fields of conflict resolution in STEM, there is a lack of female role models, mentorship, and representation in security. For a multitude of historical, political, and sociological reasons, women are not thought of as protectors, and thus are underrepresented in the work that is needed to create healthy, safe environments and personal spaces. When I first started to work in security, I did not realize that there was a lack of gender inclusivity in the field. It was not until there was an incident dealing with a sexual assault that I began to understand the importance of bringing a gender-sensitive approach to security and conflict resolution. One night, while I was doing what I call working the door, which is where security stand outside for 6 to 8 hours a night and attempt to de-escalate conflict before it begins. I'm sure you've all encountered this. There was a situation and an unwanted advance where a woman was groped. Because of my gender identity and personal experience, I immediately understood the situation and was able to help find the perp and quickly bring the police in. The guards I was working with also had a heightened awareness of the seriousness of the situation because of me being a woman. It is important to recognize that conflict resolution is not gender neutral, and there are countless instances in which diversity in gender and sexuality help to create safe space. Undersecretary General Michelle Bachelet, the head of the UN Entity for Gender Equality and Empowerment of Women, says wherever there is conflict, women must be a part of the solution. I'm encouraged to see more women in positions of authority in the security field, such as Sue Bick, who's the Director of Security at Lincoln Center, whom I work with at the circus. And I think that you may have noticed in here today there was a woman guard that has been helping us out. The security and trade associations are forming women's forums to encourage more participation. However, there is still a long way to go. So, to the young women here, in addition to urging you to be a part of student government in both high school and college, I urge you to consider fields that are security related for your careers. To everyone, I urge you to remember that security needs to be inclusive and to understand why it is a sensitive issue for all. We all deserve a safer space. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fisher. Interesting presentation. Our next speaker is Jessica Williamson, who's the Regional Director of World Information Transfer. Jessica, you have the floor.
Thank you. Your Excellency, distinguished delegates, esteemed colleagues, ladies, gentlemen, and students, I am a storyteller. And in my work here with WIT, I have focused my efforts on examining the intersections between sustainability and women's rights. And today I'm going to tell you a few stories about women. Since the modern era of terrorism began on September 11, 2001, world leaders have responded to terror by promising vengeance and waging war. They do not remember that regardless of race, religion, or gender, we are all united in humanity, and therefore we need to resolve our problems as equal partners. But when Donald Trump telephoned the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, in the aftermath of New Zealand's largest ever terrorist attack, the President asked what the United States could do, and she responded, "Send sympathy and love for all Muslim communities." By declaring that they are us, she set a new tone for how people should respond to this type of tragedy. In fact, women have been successful promoters of peace throughout history, yet have not had the opportunity of achieving it due to the policies that have prevented women from participating as equal partners. And we all know, like we heard today, that when women are in leadership positions, the world is a more fair and equitable place. This is why we have Target SDG 5.5 that ensures women's full and effective participation and equal opportunities for leadership at all levels of decision-making in political, economic, and public life. And in fact, we need SDG 5 to implement every other SDG. Yet it is the SDG that we are the furthest behind on. Now, in my work with WET, I've met all these fascinating and incredibly brave women from around the world. I met a woman named Dija from the nomadic Fulani in rural Chad. She tells me it is women who understand the cycles of nature in the Sahel Desert. For instance, if the birds are sitting on the ground during a certain time of the year, it means another year of no water. She says women in her region have known of climate change long before the scientists and bureaucrats across the world. Yet while women across the globe have the maximum amount of responsibility, they have the minimum amount of rights. And while women are co-creators with the earth, they're also left to deal with the brunt of the burden from the result of our environmental degradation. In Chad, women must also collect all the water and medicine and foods. Thus, when climate change depletes resources, it makes their journeys longer, leaving them vulnerable to thieves and police who rape them along the way. Dija also tells me that by the time women in her community are 20 years old, they are forced to have 6 or 7 children, which leaves little time for things like school. Now, women throughout the world view the world through the same biological lens as nature. We instinctively understand the need for a dynamic exchange with the earth in order for the world to be able to sustain its resources for future generations. Women carry the seeds of creation and the cycles of regeneration that is mirrored in Mother Nature. And the continual extraction and discarding of the earth's resources prevents the time for healing to take place. Furthermore, as much as women's disempowerment is the result of our consumption habits, if we want to achieve SDG 5, we will need to address our culture of commodification in which governments, institutions, and transnational corporations are complicit. Women must be given the autonomy to care for their own bodies and their own land so we can heal from the wounds along this interconnected web upon which our civilization exists, and become united as one humanity to address the ecological challenges we face. We must recognize that we are all co-creators with the earth and work with the regenerative cycles of the earth and in harmony with nature. This means not relying on technology alone to fix ecological problems. Now, what does this look like? UN Environment and General Assembly recently launched a decade of ecosystems, which plans to remove 13 to 26 gigatons of CO2 by 2030. These are the solutions I am talking about. Because if we are to achieve SDG 5, we must nurture and heal, not conquer and destroy, because that is the essence of femininity and why we need SDG 5. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. That was very, very interesting and informative. Our last presenter is Fari Gaba, who is our youth representative and also an aerospace engineer. So, Fari.
Does that work? Can anyone hear me? There we go. Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, and fellow students. It is truly an honor to be here today amongst so many distinguished speakers and rising world leaders. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, but I want to share a few of my thoughts on how we can better utilize outer space for our shared interest in urban sustainability. On Christmas Eve, 1968, the Apollo 8 spacecraft completed 3 orbits around the moon. On its 4th orbit, the astronauts peered out of the window and scrambled to capture this iconic image. Next slide, please. When the crew arrived back on Earth, Astronaut Will Anders famously said, "We went to the moon, but we actually discovered Earth." Images like these remind us that that blue dot is our home, our shared home. Half a century ago, the space frontier was a major hurdle. Today we face new hurdles: climate change, urbanization, and their effects, environmental degradation, and deteriorating public health. I think it's time we look to solve some of our terrestrial problems with extraterrestrial solutions. The solution I'd like to focus on is using satellites to image the Earth, also known as remote sensing. Next slide, please. Can anyone guess where this is? We've mentioned it a lot today. Maybe the river label gives it away in the corner. This was Chernobyl in 1986 and the beginning of public domain remote sensing. At this time, a French satellite was able to show people around the world what was happening in Chernobyl. From space, it mapped the safety exclusion zone and monitored decontamination activity. Next slide, please. This is how satellites used to look like back then. And this is what a satellite looks like today. I brought this from my work. This is the size of an imaging satellite today. Satellites have become much cheaper to build and launch. With new sensor technology and machine learning, satellite data is much more valuable. Some companies use synthetic aperture radars to capture images through clouds, at night, in 3D and beyond, and up to 1 meter resolutions. This is like reading the engravings on a dime from the other end of a football field. Other companies use hyperspectral sensors, a method for measuring infrared radiation, to determine the chemical compounds that exist in our buildings, bodies, our water bodies, our atmosphere, and our forests. But why is remote sensing so valuable for urban sustainability? Because I think you can only fix problems once you know where they are and how they change over time. I will discuss 2 ways in which remote sensing can be utilized. The first is tracking urban expansion. Next slide, please. So this video shows urban population as a percentage of national population. The darker the shade, the higher the level of urbanization. But although we're urbanizing rapidly, according to the European Commission Global Human Settlement Study, urban population densities are actually stagnating. These 2 factors point to a rapid expansion of our cities, urban sprawl, an expansion that we need to account for. Next slide, please. So experts at NYU combat this by linking urban expansion with residential development, infrastructure, urban mobility, and municipal policy patterns. Using remote sensing and commuting data, cities can be represented by these models. These lines signify citizens' commuting patterns. Next slide, please. For example, Chicago fits the monocentric model, whilst Los Angeles the constrained dispersal model. Modeling a city like this provides insights into how to enhance the city's performance as it grows, informing optimal mobility infrastructure, residential developments, or suitable expansion policy reforms. Next slide, please. Similarly, a lab at Stanford uses satellite imagery data to measure city light patterns, road widths, urban space, residential size, and water contamination. Applying machine learning to this kind of data, they can predict urban poverty levels. The graphic on the left here shows how the output data would look like, whilst on the right shows how it correlates to surveyed data. Analyses like these would allow leaders to better understand their areas, forecast urban income levels, understand each district's needs, and tailor local developmental projects. The second way to apply remote sensing is to use hyperspectral sensors to determine the relationship between urban pollutants and our public health. Next slide, please. So this video shows how emission policies have been able to successfully curb nitrogen dioxide emissions in the US Northeast from 2005 to 2011. Today, this data can be zoomed into specific urban areas. Hyperspectral sensors can also be used to measure vegetation species, water pollution, and soil moisture. Applying machine learning algorithms to these kind of data, satellites could potentially locate, predict, and help us avoid the specific urban conditions that promote the spread of disease, say malaria. By tracking the urban environment over time and geospatially, leaders will gain a better understanding of how air pollution, policy, and location translate to public health. They will then be able to tailor countermeasures all in real time. Tracking urban expansion or investigating public health are just two ways to utilize remote sensing. This is not to mention other uses, such as tracking illicit urban waste, natural disaster response, or responding to things like Chernobyl. Gathering this data now is usually done via field research, surveys, household economy measures, mobile phone usage, or even social media. Surveys are limited since they're not easily scalable. Other methods require many sensors embedded in our infrastructure, what we call a smart city solution. Some governments might restrict data collection, as we've seen with Professor Robson's talk, and they may not have the necessary institutions in place. And although smartphones are ubiquitous nowadays, data collection is very hard to scale across borders since data is usually kept private. Next slide, please. So this is what a typical remote sensing constellation looks like. These orange streaks are actually satellites. Remote sensing provides a scalable, accurate, and inexpensive way of gathering a lot of data in real time. This will allow leaders to determine temporal relationships between urban expansion, human health, and environmental degradation. They can then draft more equitable policies that meet their citizens' needs and better plan urban expansion projects. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, actually, could you go back one step? But with all its promise, real-time remote sensing still faces some major barriers. One bottleneck is actually communicating with the satellite, and this is what Odyssey is trying to solve. Since imaging satellites are in low Earth orbit, they are very close to the Earth's surface and move very fast and are rarely in line of sight. To obtain a specific image, an operator would need line of sight to command the satellite, let that satellite take the picture, and then wait for the satellite to come around again so they can download the picture at the next line of sight. For a single satellite not in a constellation like this can take over a day. Next slide now, please, thanks. This video shows Earth in the center, surrounded by many low Earth orbit satellites, and Odyssey's 3 medium Earth orbit relay satellites. Odyssey's architecture would allow an imaging satellite to send their data up to one of these relay satellites between this triangle and back down to the other side of the world instantaneously. This way, images of, say, a nuclear fallout, or a California forest fire, or a hurricane flood in the Gulf of Mexico can be captured and utilized in real time without the need to invest in a huge constellation like the one shown previously. Another major barrier is spectrum licensing. Via the International Telecommunications Union here at the UN, satellite operators must transmit signals in specific frequency bands and have a license to do so. But allocating whole sections of spectrum like this to single users is very wasteful. As an analogy, imagine that each time you bought a cell phone from your phone provider, you also had to reserve the rights to a specific frequency on which your cell phone could communicate. This would be specific to your phone, and whilst you weren't using your phone, that spectrum band would go unused. On an international and national level, we need more dynamic spectrum allocation methods. Spectra should be shared between users using new technology or market demand solutions. And finally, remote sensing has the potential to evolve into omnipresent observation of the world, violating individual privacy if policymakers do not address its privacy concerns. Today's technology can see through clouds, at night, in 3D, beyond the visible light spectrum, things we can't even see, and down to 1 meter resolutions. Although very valuable for sustainability causes, remote sensing is just as valuable for malign uses, be it industrial espionage, military operations, or national surveillance. Policymakers will need to carve out channels through which this data can be shared for sustainability causes and bridge this discordance between benevolent and malicious use of this data. Next slide, please. Speaking to my fellow students in the room, there is still much uncertainty surrounding climate change and what its onset means for our future. Amidst this uncertainty, I think one thing is certain. It's time for today's youth to step up, to be ambitious, and to take action. I think it's time to approach space for sustainability with the same fervor as we did the space race. I have compiled a document containing introductory resources to aerospace engineering and remote sensing. This document also contains links to remote sensing software, satellite imagery data, youth organizations, internships, competitions, coding resources, and the like. There will be a copy of this near the exit, and you can also come to me and scan this QR code to take it home digitally. Next slide, please. Sure. This is the last one. As the astronaut said in 1968, we discovered the Earth then, but we need to discover it again. Up until now, space has inspired many dreams, discoveries, and achievements for mankind. Now it's presenting us with yet another opportunity to reassess our approach to tackling the SDGs. Satellites are democratizing our data and bringing us closer together. I'd like to leave you with the following question. If you had access to imagery of the Earth every single day, how would you use it to solve problems in your neighborhood, in your city, in your country, on our shared blue dot? Thank you.
Thank you, Ferry. It looks like remote sensing is in competition with Facebook. Your Excellency.
I have 30 seconds.
No, I cannot tell you how much time you can do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Durbach, and thank you to all panelists and speakers today. I think it was a really important event. As you may notice, I walked out for 15 minutes and I gave the TV interview to Voice of America Ukraine, so it will be aired today in Ukraine. And obviously, I said that my main impression of this event is that there were so many young people. This is something the United Nations needs. This is 28th conference. I think we don't need to wait another 28 years to see some of you at this podium, and I'm pretty sure that it will happen very soon. I also know that you've learned many lessons from our distinguished speakers, which will help you in future. I myself learned at least one lesson from Dr. Mishkati, which I will use next week when we will start the preparatory commission for the next Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. The lesson about probably too much focus and attention on the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and elimination of nuclear weapons, which is important in itself, obviously, but there's no less important the issue of nuclear safety and the numbers which Dr. said about 450 reactors and almost more than 50 buildings. And some of them are certainly with all my respect, but they are in the countries which don't have such a level of science and development as Japan, which was demonstrated, unfortunately, by Fukushima. So we need to pay much more attention to those issues, and I will certainly, mention this, say something about in my statements next week. Thank you once again. We invite you for the next year already. I'm sorry for the problems with security, which many of you had, but unfortunately it's not under the control of the mission of Ukraine. There are, certain new rules in this building which are established by the UN security, but we will try, of course, to avoid such problems in the future. Thank you very much, and to those of you who celebrate Orthodox Easter, which is coming, Happy Easter.
Finally, it seems that the solutions to the Sustainable Development Goals depend on the knowledge and the implementation of that knowledge, as you learned today. We need to determine the impact assessment of actions that are taking place, personal, political, and industrial. As you already heard, since 2013, the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere exceeded 400 parts per million, and in the past 50 years, 60% of animal species disappeared due to human action. The axiom, think globally, act locally, should be applied on all levels by people, governments, and institutions so that policy goals can be achieved. The political pressures from disparate interests need to be resolved, since cookie-cutting solutions rarely make effective policies for people. Finally, efficacious crafting of the SDG policies for their impact on society is essential for achieving success. Once again, I'm deeply grateful to His Excellency Ambassador Yelchenko and to our presenters for their illuminating presentations. I also want to thank our administrator, Fred Younghabi, Fred, and all our interns for making this conference possible. Thank you for your participation. The meeting is adjourned.